It's part 2 of PortArthur. We covered the battle and blockade in part 1. Now it's time for the siege. Also, some of you may have noticed that something was missing from the first part, so yeah, there's 2 of them. We're going back to August 1904, where 50,000 Russian troops under Major General Anatoly Stosel held up in PortArthur and were awaiting the arrival of at least 150,000 Japanese troops under General Nogi Marasuki. So one thing the Russians had going for them was terrain. The outside of the city was a line of hills, and not little rolling hills. We're talking 600-foot high hills, not to be confused with 600 high heels. It was decided that the Japanese would start by attacking these 2 hills here. I'm not even going to try to say their actual names, so I'm going to use their nicknames, Big Orphan Hill and Little Orphan Hill. Seeing as they were kind of isolated, they had views over quite a bit of open ground and were not that heavily fortified. However, at the bottom of the hills was a river that the Russians had flooded, and at the top, well, did not matter though. On the morning of August 7th, the Japanese began shelling the city, and around 7:30 that night, the Japanese began their attack on the Orphan Hills. Many Japanese drowned in the river, and those that made it to the bottom of the hill in the rain and dark, by the way, had to crawl their way up in the mud while dodging artillery, machine gun fire, and searchlights. The first attempt failed, but General Nogi wasn't done. He started a new assault the next day, and though they faced many of the same issues, the Japanese were able to finally take both hills, mostly through sheer will of numbers by the morning of the 9th, losing over 3,000 men in the process. And remember, these were the not as heavily fortified hills. Also, with the loss of the hills, the Russian fleet left in the harbor was ordered to get out, but they were stopped by the Japanese at the Battle of the Yellow Sea, trapping them in the harbor. We'll get back to them. On the 19th, the Japanese began their next move, a multi-fronted attack on 174-meter hill, guess what's named that, fortifications at East and West Panlung, and an attempt to take the Wantai Ravine. Now, the hill had 3 layers of trenches and barbed wire that the Japanese had to fight their way through, and the fighting was a combination of firearms, artillery, and hand-to-hand combat, and yet again, through sheer numbers, the Japanese were able to take the hill on August 20th. They were also able to take the fortifications not long after, but failed to take the ravine, partially due to the use of electrified wire, and when the assault ended, 16,000 Japanese were dead or wounded. On the 25th, traditional siege operations began, the Japanese digging trenches with the intention of tunneling under the Russian walls and setting off mines. This would eventually pay off, but we'll get to that. They also continued to shell the port and were able to bring in both reinforcements and larger artillery. And we're talking guns that could fire 500-pound shells over 5 miles. In fact, they ended up firing over 35,000 of these shells during the siege. The Japanese made gains little by little, but they and the Russians realized that the key to the city was 203-meter hill, which overlooked the city and, more importantly, the harbor. If Japan could take 203, they could shell the ships in the harbor and take the city. But the Russians had greatly fortified the hill with steel and concrete structures surrounded by electrified barbed wire. The Japanese began attacking the hill on September 20th, and by the end of October, the hill was still in Russian hands. The Japanese had lost over 3,000 men, and General Nogi was on the verge of being court-martialed. In fact, he was only saved by the Emperor himself stepping in. Another attempt was made to take the hill on November 26th, which also failed and cost at least 4,000 more lives. On the 28th, another attempt began, this one accompanied by artillery that fired over 1,000 of those 500-pound shells on just that first day. The Russians held their own with a combination of machine gun fire and improvised hand grenades. Oh, and it should be noted that by this point, the Russians were being ravaged by scurvy and dysentery. On the 30th, the Japanese succeeded in planting their flag at the top of the hill, however they lost it back to the Russians the next morning. Fighting continued between the two sides, attacking and counterattacking until December 5th when the Japanese finally took the hill and held it. Just the final attack, by the way, cost the Japanese over 8,000 men, including among them the general's last surviving son. With the hill taken, Japanese spotters began to call in locations for the Russian ships in the harbor. They had run miles of telephone line to keep communication open after the Russians had succeeded in jamming their radio signals, and with the spotters' help, the Japanese artillery made short work of the Russian fleet, and they sank the entire fleet with the exception of the final remaining battleship, Sevastopol, who had moved out of range. However, Admiral Togi, yeah, he was still there, wanted to finish off the Pacific fleet once and for all, so he sent waves of ships to sink the Sevastopol. And yeah, they all failed. Even after firing 124 torpedoes at the Russian ship, she was still able to sink 2 Japanese ships and damage 6 more. And while all that was going on, the leadership in Port Arthur had some decisions to make. The Japanese tunnel and bomb plan had started to work, with several Russian forts being destroyed by mines. On January 1st, Japanese forces took the ravine, and Russian leadership sent word to the Japanese general looking for surrender. This was agreed to, and on January 5th, Russian forces handed Port Arthur over to the Japanese. During the siege, the Russians had over 30,000 casualties, with Japanese casualties varying based on report, but they landed somewhere between 57,000 and 110,000. The war ended in September of that year, and it's no coincidence that the First Russian Revolution also began that year. Oh, and the Sevastopol, which I probably haven't been pronouncing right this whole time, but whatever, yeah, the Japanese never sank her. Instead, rather than have her fall into enemy hands, her captain flooded and sank his own ship. Well, I mean, it worked.